Everybody needs a place to hang their jackets and hats. And since that treadmill you bought last January won't fit near the door, you're probably going to need a haul tree. In this video, I'm building a custom haul tree for a customer with very limited space near their door, and I'm going to show you how you can customize this process for your own space. I start every customer project by asking them for inspiration photos that they've seen online, and either taking measurements myself or getting them from them. In this case, the customer told me they had very limited space to work with, but wanted something like these two pictures.
And I sketched up this design in Fusion 360 with some cubbies on top, drawers on the bottom, and accent molding on the back to make it more interesting. With their approval, I got straight to work.
We're going to start with this Baltic birch plywood. After seeing that first cut, it's just not deep enough for the base. So I've gone back to the drawings and the measurements that she's given me, and I'm making a slight adjustment to give her some extra room. Things look a lot different on the computer than they do in real life, I'll tell you that.
Here's what I mean. On the drawing, everything looks pretty reasonable. But when I ripped the width from that first sheet, I realized these drawers are only going to end up having like 8 inches of usable space from front to back. And while there may be other scenarios that having 8 inches in your drawers is a good thing, I feel like in this case we're losing valuable storage space for their balls. You know, sports balls, shoes, equipment. Anyway, I messaged the customer and they agreed that we should ditch the drawers in favor of usable space. So I got back to cutting the plywood for the base. I think it would have been easier to have just built a center support under a larger shelf, but that first hiccup threw my mojo off a little bit. So instead, I cut individual vertical and horizontal squares with the intention of joining them all with pocket screws. I cut a spacer you can't see here from scrap plywood to keep the distance from the shelf to the floor consistent. Then I used a clamp and a speed square to make sure everything was at the right angle as I attached them all together with pocket screws. Like I said, this totally worked, but if I were doing it again, I think it would have been more straightforward to just use a long top and bottom shelf and then wedge in the uprights with a center support under the bottom. Since these top spreaders aren't going to be visible, I had some non-fancy but more expensive plywood that I squared and cut to length. I used 3/4 inch screws for the outer joints so it wouldn't break through the outside faces of the wood, but I used 1 inch screws for the inner joints so that it would break through into the other spreaders for additional support. I cut the shelves and upper supports so that the backing would slide between the outer uprights up against the center cubbies and top spreaders. This way, I could secure it all around and still have minimal visible nails to patch later.
With the base completed, I'm going to put a face frame on the front, work on the seat, and then get started on the top.
I cut the face frame for this from MDF. And as much as people hate on this stuff, unless you don't take care of it or dip it in water for a long period of time, it's pretty amazing, especially for facing, trim, and cabinet doors. I chose it for the face frames because it's reliable and consistent. The temperature change a month from now isn't going to cause it to separate and twist at every seam I'm about to laboriously sand smooth. After primer and paint, that should ensure it stays exactly like it looks here in the shop for many years to come.
If I haven't mentioned it, I love this Craig stuff. Like, they make some really, I'm not sponsored by them, not that I'm against that sort of thing, but.
The reason I mention that is that I use that AccuCut XL and this pocket hole jig on almost every project. So while you can certainly do this and other projects without them, they sure do make life easier. I drilled pocket holes all around that face frame, then used the straight edge of the table to smush everything together before driving in the pocket screws. Then I used the straight edge on the other side of the table to get things lined up and attached the face frame with a pin nailer. There was a slight overhang at the top, but otherwise the base is ready to set aside for finish prep. To get rid of that, I just ran the whole base across the table saw and got it nice and level for the seat. Speaking of which, I started working on the seat next because it was going to take a few days. I cut it to length with a little overhang on one side, then ripped it to the correct depth on the table saw. Then I used a 1/2 inch roundover bit on the router to put a nice soft edge on the top and bottom of the front and left sides. I left the other two sides straight because they will butt up against the wall during installation. I sanded it down to 220 on all sides and did a quick test fit to make sure everything lined up as expected. It fit perfectly, so I moved it over to the sawhorses for pre-staining. This stuff has to dry for at least 6 hours, so I wanted to go ahead and get it applied so I could work on the rest while it worked its magic. The top presented a little bit of a challenge. The width was 51 inches, but if I just ripped a 3-inch strip and attached it to a 48-inch wide piece, it would have an ugly seam right in the focal point of the piece. So I needed to get the seams to be symmetrical so I could cover them with the molding. To do this, I ripped 7 inches off the 48-inch wide piece, then cut 2 5-inch wings for either side. Then I just drilled a few pocket holes, applied some glue, and screwed them all together. Problem solved. I ripped the sides, top, and shelf from the rest of the final 4x8 sheet and cut them to length on the miter saw. I used glue and clamps to do the initial fit around the outside edges. This allowed me to work slower and be able to adjust along the way and ensure all angles were straight and correct. Once I was happy with the fit, I used a 15-gauge nailer all around. I chose that because it'll be really easy to hide those connections with joint compound. Next, I measured up from the bottom to get the correct shelf height, then attached the shelf and cubby dividers. Now onto the trim. I started on the face frame, but shifted gears and decided to do the molding first, so I wouldn't accidentally mess up the face frame during that process somehow. I laid out each piece, starting from the top and working down, keeping things symmetrical and marking the distances as I went to make final assembly easier. For assembly, I rolled glue onto the back of each piece, then, following the marks I made earlier, attached them using the pin nailer. Then I assembled the face frame upside down on the front of the piece. This made it easier to sanity check along the way and adjust. Then I just had to flip it over to attach it. At this point, I just kind of wanted to look at it and make sure there were no glaring defects and that it was shaping up how I'd imagined. I've been building stuff for over 20 years, and I'm still just as surprised and excited when things look good and work out like they're supposed to. And this looked great. Now for arguably the most important part of the build, the finish prep. You can make up for a multitude of sins during this step, but it requires time and attention to detail. I used joint compound on all the nail holes and gaps, caulked the seams, and sanded all the joints down flat before applying more joint compound to those. Several rounds of sanding later, and it was ready for primer and paint. Except I forgot the crown molding. So I added that by cutting the 45s and pin nailing it to the top. Then added the joint compound and hand sanded all the grooves down slick. I snagged this Wagner paint booth on Amazon for like $50. And after hand rolling the last few cabinet projects, I had resolved I was going to be all HVLP all the time from now on. It worked with this primer, but I probably should either use a different, thinner primer or thin this stuff next time. Either way, I did 3 coats of primer here to make sure everything was nice and clean. For the paint, this was a completely different experience. The spray was so nice and clean and just looked amazing even after the first coat. It also used a fraction of the paint that normally rolling would use. I think I ended up using 3 coats and it was just 1.5 of the cups on the top of the HVLP gun. This paint was from Lowe's, but the color is called Carolina Gull by Benjamin Moore and was specifically requested by the customer. I also ended up spraying 3 coats of General Finishes High Performance Gloss, and it went on like glass. And for all of this, I used the same $30 HVLP gun that I bought from Amazon. I love how this build turned out, and unfortunately I lost the footage from the installation, but the customer loved it too, and we're already discussing another project for them. Check out the description for a list of tools and items used in this video, along with links to my other social media outlets where you can get more frequent updates. Thanks so much for watching. See you next time.